Hello, this video talk is for the purposes of video recording, an artist talk I did on the 26th of March 2024, just a few days ago, at Art for Humanity in Durban. And I'm recording it for the purposes of archiving that talk as well as to facilitate greater distribution because it wasn't a live event. I've entitled this talk Gone to Ground, and of course this is a talk for African Documentary Photography Archive Initiative, which is in association with Art for Humanity, a collaboration. So the talk is entitled Gone to Ground, and I'll go straight into it. My talk will outline key developments and originating concepts that have defined my career, as well as attempting to contextualize them within broader events and shifts in our society, as well as globally. It seems pertinent and significant to begin with what first brought me to documentary photography. I always had an ability to draw, but this was never developed beyond my own personal efforts. Further, I was also ejected from school with a junior high school certificate qualification for a minor misdemeanor, which makes me largely self-taught. The school that ejected me had shut down an attempt by students, including myself, and a sympathetic teacher to run an art class. And that was like within the year that I was expelled, but had nothing to do with it, just for interest's sake. After my sudden ejection from junior high school, I worked for 8 years as a semi-skilled worker in the sugar industry, starting soon after my 16th birthday. This period was hugely significant in shaping my emerging consciousness, exposing me to the cold face of apartheid as it did, and the economic and social engineering imperatives which drove it. I joined the emerging organized worker movement. I began my working career in 1974, and the workers' unions began to form after the Durban dock workers organized and won this right in 1973. The sugar industry was at the forefront of this movement, albeit problematically. I became a workers' representative and eventually participated in a strike. To this day, class continues to be a defining focus of how I view society and understand it. And the sugar industry, still contesting as the dominant economy of this province, and devoid of criticism as it is, has been a focus of my work. The sugar industry, of course, in a neo-colonial context, is hugely significant in defining our overall economy and social reality. From the get-go of becoming a worker, I was acutely aware that this was not how I intended to live my life. But finding alternatives during a time of apartheid job restriction was challenging. To be designated coloured and without tertiary education was to be destined for the trades at best. And I remain no tradesman to this day. Of course, along with worker organisation came the events that transpired in the public sphere. Following the vacuum that existed post-Sharpeville massacre and the banning of resistance organizations like the African National Congress, the Pan-African Congress, and the South African Students' Organization, erupted June 16 in 1976, and the flames that engulfed the entire nation, a spark that ignited the consciousnesses of all long-suffering South Africans, including mine. We were irretrievably altered by these events, and it didn't take me long to abandon any ideas of going into business, like my dad, to make a respectable living somewhat outside the confines of apartheid job preservation, not to mention that business for black folks itself was severely circumscribed by apartheid as well. It was into this void that quite by chance I came across documentary photography as the genre of choice, even though there was zero possibility of making a livelihood out of it. Then, as is the case today, and determined as I was to pursue a life work that would contribute to the change I saw as being urgently necessary. In a sense, I came to photography in search of a medium that would accommodate my political activism. And yes, this pursuit was possibly from naivety. But whatever it takes to help you find your purposes is all right by me, and I have absolutely no regrets in the choices I made back then. Discovering photography after attempting both painting and writing with very little success, since I knew neither a single writer or painter, or indeed any artist at the time, and had no idea as to where I might find them, or indeed schools to learn these skills. Subsequently, I made a video documentary on Rookstrift Arts and Crafts Centre, partly as a homage to the art school I should have attended, had I been aware of its existence then, which was not 200 kilometers distance from where I worked and aspired to painting in the late 70s, and which shut down in 1982. Why it was possible to be gripped by photography requires some insight. Although I grew up in a typically book-deprived environment, typical for the largely rural and working-class families in mixed-race and black communities, my father subscribed to Time Life publications, which also contained the photographic work of some of the finest Western documentary photographers at the time. And subsequently, I also subscribed to Time magazine whilst working in the sugar industry, further exposing me to some great documentary photography, along with the American propaganda it espoused. So I had unconscious exposure to this work from a young age. Having discovered photography as an epiphany, as I sometimes describe it, I was very fortunate to meet many supportive existing documentary photographers from the very beginning of my involvement in photography, and formed life-lasting relationships with these individuals. Through such relationships, I was also fortunate to be able to join the photographic collective and agency Afripix from its inception in 1982, and remained a member until its demise in 1991. Afripix was instrumental in developing my career. The nature of Afripix's association allowed for me and others to continue seamlessly after its demise. Afripix was self-funded, which meant that its members funded it with a 30% payment deduction from all their income from their photography, derived from both inside and outside of Afripix. This was done consciously to protect our independence and sovereignty. Further, we individually determined our own choice of subject matter. But before I joined Afripix officially, I embarked on a 3-month road trip to Swaziland and a newly liberated Zimbabwe in 1981, and in 1982, an almost year-long backpacking sojourn in Europe, which was meant to have been India and Asia, but through my ignorance, I settled for Europe. This time out was the necessary education I needed in giving me the perspective on my homeland I sorely needed. In Europe, purely by chance again, I met the dissident, exiled South African art community and developed a healthy perspective on the role of culture and art in society. I was offered the chance to join them in exile, with offers of entry into prestigious art, film and media schools, but chose to return into the breach, the fray, and have my say, which I did. Artists were often exiled in the days of apartheid, when, for instance, read black and brown artists, they left to tour or study abroad. They were often given a one-way visa to leave and never return, and of course some chose to do this voluntarily. Afripix, of course, existed during a time of heightened political consciousness, and this was arguably the reason for its existence and activity within the country and region. And so it was natural for us to focus on these developments, earning us the moniker of struggle photographers, one which I wear with pride to this day. This was also the era of the cultural worker, and the faction I supported within Afripix was that which identified with this role. The year of my return, and joining Afripix proper in the newly opened Johannesburg office of the South African Council of Churches, Khotso House, and their interchurch media project, which kind of incubated Afripix, was 1983, which was also the year of the formation of the United Democratic Front and the many organizations under its umbrella. This frenzy of organization provided us with much material, most of it not yet seen, and some will emerge in the archive, which is the reason for this artist talk. This was in a sense humdrum work, covering hours of political meetings in airless rooms, but no political change occurs without such effort, and what it did earn us as Afripix was respect and trust, which gained us further access to communities and organizations. Afripix was really an association of independent photographers who united to pool their resources, and so we were a rather unruly bunch, who at first were content to submit to the vision of the two founders, Omar Bacha and Paul Weinberg. Yes, there were a few others, but it was these two who drove the organization's early vision. In Afripix, we held weekly meetings in which we shared the work and projects we were currently occupied with, as well as the joint projects such as exhibitions that we were producing. We also had a newsbeat to ensure that major news issues were covered, as well as the events that mattered to our main constituency, the organizations under the UDF umbrella, including trade unions. It was in meeting the needs of this newsbeat that I made my short-lived advent into photojournalism, although I had previously worked briefly as a stringer in the Star and the Sunday Times, and I think even the Rand Daily Mail. In Johannesburg in 1983 and 84, I was offered a job in the Star's Extra supplement. Those of you old enough will know and remember that the editions of most newspapers that service black readerships were mostly known as extras. But I turned it down then because I was being offered a salary less than the income I was currently earning as a freelancer, which was itself extremely low. Whilst in Durban, Afripix collaborated with Concord, the journalist collective, and its committee which produced the briefly lived KwaZulu-Natal newspaper, The New African. Working in the mainstream media, which later also included stringing for the wire agencies such as Agence France Presse and Associated Press, was also a huge education into how news was sourced, the angle that defined how the story evolved, and the editors and their role in spiking stories that did not fit the publication's main angle. I saw how events I had attended and seen with my own two eyes were manipulated out of the reality that had unfolded to fit these concerns. I had of course been aware of this from the outset, but seeing it in action was truly transformative. Publications such as the Daily News and the Natal Mercury were particularly prone to such disinformation, whilst back then the Natal Witness was often a lot closer to the truth as we knew it. Afripix, of course, also serviced the alternative media that flourished in the 1980s, being the first informal photo departments for the Weekly Mail, today's Mail and Guardian, and Die Vrije Weekblad, and a main source of photography for publications such as Speak in Johannesburg and the Worker Feminist Speak in Natal, as well as a plethora of emerging alternate publications. Although we had photographers in the Cape, we were not as organized there, so were not quite as active as in the then Transvaal, and for some time in Natal. Afripix also had a focus on photography education and ran workshops whenever it could, for trade unions, civic and youth organizations, and the like, and we even famously ran a workshop in Mapumulu for the Lutheran Church clergy. In these workshops, which introduced basic photography concepts, we also focused on visual literacy, with a view to raising awareness of the role of images in state and capitalist propaganda, and how imagery could be used to further people's agendas. What brought me back to Natal for the first time in late 1984 was to help out in the family business when sickness and distress threatened the family livelihood. I had returned for a few weeks in early 84 to produce photographs of rural and working women, since 1984 was the International Year of Women, and Afripix was producing an exhibition to commemorate this event. Working from the family home, based in a rural area and close to both the KwaZulu homeland of Macambini and the Bantustan border industrial area of Isitebe, was an ideal and low-cost way to access and create these images. Whilst there, I was struck by the hardships my family faced, with a sick father, a distressed mother, and their ailing business. Not having financial solutions to ease this condition, I elected to return and contribute my youthful energy. This was a period worth commenting on. As I arrived in 1984 in the then Zululand, where our family smallholding is located, and where I currently reside, and am recording this video talk, in the repurposed building that was our former trading store. This was the first of 2 timeouts from photography, although ironically it was during these periods that I then worked almost purely as a documentary photographer. I was commissioned, or rather delegated, by Afripix to service the need for photographs by Clarion Call, which was the KwaZulu Homeland Legislature publication, and came to cover the inner workings of the KwaZulu government for a brief period in the mid-80s, until the violence that erupted at Ongoya campus of the University of KwaZulu, whereupon Afripix made the decision to withdraw from supplying the service. This brief stint allowed for the documentation of a hitherto undocumented Bantustan government. It was also during this period that I began in earnest to document the very large family I originate from, the Dans of Zululand, and the region the community is embedded in, largely being Mangeta, Mandini, Emoyeni, Mtunzini, Ongoya, and Eshowe, formerly known as Dansland. The original idea for this documentation was my early questions surrounding identity, namely mixed race and so-called colored or hybridized identity. My exposure to black consciousness, and before that, negritude, and the Black Power and Black Panther movements had necessitated this questioning on the nature of being black, and in particular an examination of this constituency that regarded itself as colored, and indeed had evolved as a separate group, as its creators had intended. This finally resulted 20 years later in the exhibition Blood Relatives. 2 years later, my main objectives largely met. I moved to Durban, arriving in 1986 at the onset of the state of emergency. Here I was catapulted into the tumultuousness of the advent of the Natal War, and a country indeed in a state of civil war. My weekends were spent documenting the funerals of murdered comrades, which were deployed as political events to take the struggle forward. It was here also that I witnessed the deployment of the state in what are now well-documented facts about the proxy nature of Inkatha and the Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP, and their United Workers' Union of South Africa, UWUSA, and their contestations for power with the emerging United Democratic Front, the UDF, and Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. As someone with some command of Zulu, it was instructive to listen to the hours-long speeches of Mangosuthu Buthelezi and hear the divergence of content as he switched between Zulu and English. The call to action for the traditional Zulu constituency was loud and clear. It was in this state of emergency period that I came to terms with my mortality. I had come to the attention of the security police and was being pressured to work for the state, and began to understand that the escalation of violence could only lead to my early demise. I predicted that I wouldn't live to see 40 years of age, and would probably fall in the line of duty, much as have the now over 130 Palestinian journalists who are targeted for being journalists, arrested, sniped, and often eliminated in targeted bomb strikes on their homes, which eradicate their entire families. It is not hyperbole to have imagined such, since we were aware back then as to the support the apartheid state received from Israel and its security apparatus, including the Mossad. In Afripix, apart from the images generated daily, we held many exhibitions, such as Beyond the Barricades and The Cordoned Heart, amongst others, as well as conducting workshops in photography, mainly to raise visual awareness and consciousness as well as sharing technical skills. In reality, Afripix was about much more than that of documenting funerals and raised fists. And I'd hazard a guess and say 80% or more of the work we produced focused on the socio-economic and human conditions of life under apartheid and neo-colonial oppression, domination, and exploitation. The resistance to these conditions, the so-called struggle, was an important corollary to the above, or so it seemed to us at the time. When Paul and Umar's vision began to differ, Umar insisting on our political activist roots and our role as cultural workers, and Paul on diverting to a more professional and independent stance, the organization began to experience strains, and at some point, Umar was expelled on tenuous grounds, and I participated in killing my mentor. And soon after, a huge split occurred, which saw the professional sector hive off and form a rival, if short-lived, photography agency called South. I presided over the closure of Afripix, and when after the split we could not sustain the costs of keeping the organization functioning, as the professionals were largely well-educated, middle-class, well-resourced people with access to the local and global media, and we who were the remainers were anything but that. The irony of Afripix closing as freedom was beckoning is not lost on me. Suffice to say, my mentor was big enough to re-establish our relationship, which remains strong to this day. I speak often of my mentors, my many mentors, as they have played a big role in my life. A book on Afripix is finally being written by cultural theorist, art critic, and academic Professor Nilika Jawadin. I'm led to understand that this book will indeed delve into the more lurid aspects of the various scenarios and characters that evolved in Afripix. And I can't deny being a bit anxious as to how that will play out, and of course how I will be portrayed, to be honest. But this is beyond my control, and suffice to say, Afripix played an instrumental role in documenting the changes that occurred in the decade of the 80s. Into this organization was poured the energy of my youth. The demise of Afripix was the closest I've come to a fractious divorce. The second absence from photography was in 1991, after the dissolution of Afripix, when I felt a compelling need to return to the soil, build a mud hut, and apprentice myself to my father and work under his command in his large market garden. It is one of the few regrets that I have that I wasn't able to do this, being persuaded rather to re-enter the family business, which was a humble country trading store, and extract it from the commercial failure it faced once again. Again, here I documented locally the advent of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the voter preparations for the 1994 elections, as well as continuing to photograph extended family. Post-Afripix, needless to say, I was at the time mystified by the events that led to 1994, and even more so by the events after 1994, in which we made an about turn from our socialist ideals into the belly of capitalism. The advent of democracy and political emancipation, however, also allowed for a period of introspection, resulting in my first solo exhibition in 1996 at the Kwamuhle Museum in Durban, under the directorship of Ruxana Umar, assisted by Paul Tichman, called The Hidden Years, a project which had originally intended to be a book and has yet to achieve that status, and which looked at the processes that had existed and occurred in the then province of Natal up to the coming of political emancipation and democracy. During this post-94 period, 1995 to 2005, since the NGO sector that had previously supported me had largely disappeared post-94, I worked mainly in public relations, as I had a teenage daughter to support who had discovered brand names and private school fees, and tertiary education was beckoning. This foray into PR gave me great insights into the working of commerce and advertising and the propaganda of capitalism. Edward Bernays, the acknowledged pioneer of public relations and the advertising industry propaganda, and its guru to this day, was greatly admired by Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and the Nazis, and his techniques studied and studiously applied. I did also work briefly for such peri-state institutions such as the Development Bank of Southern Africa. It proved impossible to work for government itself. My lack of a matric certificate and qualification, or indeed a tertiary education, precluded this possibility of gaining permanent employment in, for instance, the Government Communications and Information Services, with GCIS, and I refused to take on commissioned work with them because they insisted on owning full copyright of materials produced on commission. I have long been a firm advocate of guarding my intellectual property rights and copyright, and I never took on full employment in commercial publications largely for this reason, or newspapers for that matter, apart from the fact that I never set out to be a photojournalist in the first place. In 1998, I was headhunted by David Goldblatt, one of South Africa's foremost documentary photographers and the founder of the Market Photography Workshop, to take up the position of director of the MPW, and held that position as agreed until the year 2000. My main focus during my tenure at MPW was to integrate the institution into the broader photography, ecology and industry, ensuring that students had exposure to those working at the media and arts coalface, to opportunities to work abroad, and the life-changing experience this afforded. A final year or course student exhibition, and importantly, a mentoring project for black women photographers that was initiated and driven by Candice Blaze, my American female manager, and I'm eternally grateful for her, which radically increased their success rate. During this period, I continued to participate in many group exhibitions, which can be viewed on my resume page on my website, and there'll be a link in the comment section below, as well as participating in photography industry-related bodies. In 2005, I again exhibited solo in Blood Relatives, launched at the Old Fort Art Gallery at Constitution Hill, Johannesburg. Blood Relatives, which I initiated and commenced work on in 1983, working on intermittently until I was compelled to complete the project 23 years later in 2005. Blood Relatives also had the distinction of becoming a made-for-TV video documentary, which I directed. This project, of course, examined so-called colored or hybridized identity formation and expression in an apartheid and neo-colonial context. In 2009, I joined the German Zeipel Gallery and had many solo shows with the gallery. So began my advent in earnest into the art world. And in 2011, I produced, with a great deal of help from the gallery, a mid-career retrospective titled Call and Response, which covered the first 30 years of my career in photography. I was also fortunate to have it produced as a catalogue, thanks to the German publisher Hachi Kanz. Call and Response toured extensively both in the country and abroad. I spent a year reviewing my first 30 years of work to edit the images that comprised Call and Response. This monumental task, along with earlier efforts in the mid-90s to digitize negatives and produce a website, I believe I'm the first documentary photographer to do so in South Africa, confirmed my earlier conviction, one that was from the onset of my journey as a photographer, that I was producing a life work that needed to exist as a coherent body, which we have later come to understand as the archive. This work, which I also understand as a contribution to the country's family photo album, joins a chorus of other similar voices, both nationally and globally. In 2011, around the time of Call and Response, I was also awarded the inaugural Johannesburg Art Fair Prize and was the featured artist at the fair. I found it interesting that although the corporation First National Bank sponsored the fair and the art prize, it did not deem it fit to include my work in its extensive art collection. Indeed, my work is not included in any corporate collections and is only in very few private collections, although it has been acquired by most public collections. As to why this is the case, I can only surmise that it must be a legacy of the Cold War and the direction Western art was subjected to by the Congress of Cultural Freedoms, tasked as it was to bring the center of the Western art world from Paris to Washington and New York, fitting for the new center of empire the US had become. The freedoms expressed by modern art in abstract expressionism and the like were perfect to reflect the so-called freedoms of democracy versus the perceived rigidity and antiquity of that of the Soviet Union and a dying European civilization and culture. And it must be said that the Congress of Cultural Freedoms was a creation of the Central Intelligence Agency and a plethora of other foundations and individuals that were driven by this organization to effect this monumental shift in the art world. Some would say the creation of modern art. An essential part of that pivot was that of the introduction and elevation of existential philosophies, such as those of Kant, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Marquise, Nietzsche, and others. I'm probably massacring these names, who also critiqued Marxist theory. The postmodern world no longer produces much more than narratives, of which conceptual is an integral part, and an enemy of the postmodern art movement is realism, and in particular that which promotes class consciousness. That legacy lingers on in a postmodern Western art world, still firmly centered in Washington and New York, morphed through conceptual into identity politics, breaking down humanity into smaller and smaller demographics, perhaps the easier to divide and conquer. Like David Goldblatt, who was eventually accepted into this art world, largely, I believe, by his philosophy and his critique of values, one I found vague enough to find acceptance as it could be seen to espouse the values of the rules-based order, read Western values. But like David, I don't really have an opinion as to whether the work I produce is indeed art, while noting the irony of my delivery of this artist talk, or indeed being widely accepted as such by artists as it is. It does seem that the art world is conflicted in this regard, as it is certainly subject to opaqueness when it comes to who is included into these hallowed halls or not. I guess one can talk about the art industry. That is, undecided. I'd hazard a guess and say that some of my work is accepted as art by many artists themselves. I was, after all, awarded the FNB Art Fair Award unanimously by a panel of artist jurors, and William Kentridge himself has commended my work as being important. Whilst the industry itself is undecided as to whether what I do is in fact what it considers to be art. Personally, whilst I self-describe myself as not being a photographer's photographer, I do think that certain photographs can be and indeed are works of art, even those depicting reality, bearing out the proverbial saying that reality is stranger than fiction, and art is sometimes more than the human imagination, drawing from a universal well, perhaps. Reality can often be difficult to imagine, but can present in ways that are truly extraordinary about the human condition, making the incomprehensible universe more hospitable to the human mind, whilst making life strange again, all the more to truly see it and more fully comprehend it. Being self-taught or an autodidact, as I mentioned earlier, has some bearings on these and other questions and deserves some elaboration. Photography plays an essential role in our economic model, mainly in commercial and advertorial photography, as a lubricant to commodification. Its role in the formation of ideas and in information is also being increasingly understood. As an instrument and medium that can project culture, of which media and art is a part, it enters a highly contested terrain, that of the projection and contestation of ideas and philosophies of being. Academia, or institutions of higher learning, are crucial to the formation, development, and propagation of such ideas and philosophies, wittingly or otherwise. Our art world is in fact an iteration of the Western art world, which is itself that of about 20% of the global population, the other 80% being that of the global South, into which orbit we, as in Southern Africa, are being drawn into as we emerge into a multipolar world via our association with BRICS, with all its birth pangs, complicated by a dying collective Western empire, desperate to cling on to power and all it entails. Art itself has existed from time immemorial. The oldest documented artwork is in neighboring Botswana, in the Tsodilo Hills, and dated back 70,000 years, and has been and is present in every culture past and present. No doubt, the Western iteration of the art world and its art industry is by far the dominant one globally, given that contemporary empire knows well its purpose and efficacy in projecting power and influence, and has lavishly favored what we call contemporary art, as can be witnessed by the many corporations, foundations, private wealth and hedge funds, fund patrons engaged in and involved in the art industry. Most art schools are fully complicit in preparing students for this world, which is about to undergo rapid and fundamental change as the epochal shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world occurs. And the expressions and indeed foundations of the present Western-dominated art world inexorably shift to reflect those of the emerging multipolar world and its multifaceted aspects of expression. Sorry about that. Post my mid-career retrospective call and response, whilst producing solo exhibitions that both drew from my extensive archive as well as contemporary produced works, such as the exhibition In Camera produced in 2009 in conjunction with the Wits School of Community Development and Apartheid Archive Study Project, as well as Kweto Konavali in 2011, which looked at the legendary conventional military battle between the Angolan FPLA, UNITA, the Cubans, and the Apartheid South African Defence Force, this SADF, in which the SADF and its allies suffered a huge defeat in a conventional battle, some say the largest conventional battle in Africa since World War II, which caused the South African apartheid government to re-evaluate their military stance and engage in dialogue, resulting in Namibia's freedom and the release of South African political prisoners and parties, and the eventual democracy of 1994, as well as group shows such as Then and Now, 8 South African photographers in 2007, Paul Weinberg show, and from Piernef to Gugulective at the Execo in 2010, to name a few. Later, my work took a turn when I became interested in what I call deep South African history, or our foundational history, and produced in 2014 the solo exhibition Unsettled, 100 Years War of Resistance by Xhosa against Boer and British, which examines this prehistory through contemporary images that trace its trajectory mostly through the landscape that it unfolded in, and the artifacts and remains such as sculptural commemorations and the like. This work was inspired by Eastern Cape ex-Premier Stofile Mkenkesi's grasp of the history of the region and the Uruguayan journalist, novelist, and activist Eduardo Galeano, and his concept of building historical memory against the desert of organized forgetting. We are organized to forget. I discovered at one of the launches of Unsettled from Professor Rory Bester, who opened the exhibition, that this was indeed aftermath photography, albeit several hundred years after the fact. Unsettled is now part of a trilogy project called Joining the Thread, Surviving Dispossession, Erasure, and Genocide, which delves further back into our past and includes work on the dispossession, erasure, and genocide of the Khoi and San Bushmen, which I call Return, as the Khoi identity has returned after almost 100 years of erasure, and the Khoi and Bushmen resisted settler incursions for well over 100 years, as well as that of our almost 200-year history of slavery, which I provisionally call bondage. In the mid-1700s, there were more slaves in the Cape than settlers and indigenous folk. So many were imported, first from India, and not to be confused with the indentured Indians of the mid-1800s, then from Asia, especially Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, and that region by the Dutch colonists. Then for the next 100 years, mainly from Africa, Ghana, Angola, and Mozambique, amongst other regions. These slaves were reclassified as coloured, as were the indigenous Khoi and Bushman folk, who lost their identity as African, also becoming part of the amorphousness of the category of coloured. Unsettled was also fortunate to be published. As I say fortunate because it is extremely difficult to publish books, photography books, or indeed catalogues in South Africa, unless one is extremely well known and can guarantee sales or adept at fundraising, something the ADPI archive project intends to address. And as I said earlier, I'm indebted to Hachikans and my gallery, Zypel Gallery, for making that possible, as well as the co-publishing of Fourth Wall Publishers, Bronwyn Law, Fillion, that made that first publication possible. A project I've wanted to do for at least the last 20 years or so is that of the Zimbabwean land reform, the so-called land invasions, especially that of the over 100,000 black women Zimbabweans who now own land and are farmers. Very unusual for Africa to have such a large demographic of women owning land, and a revolutionary act indeed. Many, at least a third of these women farmers, because to have been a recipient of the land reform process in Zimbabwe, one needed to be settled on the land and indeed farming it, are deemed to be successful farmers, something which escapes the attention of our mainstream media. Journalist Joseph Hanlon and academics Jeanette Manjenjwa and Teresa Smart have dispelled this mainstream media myth of the failures of black farmers in Zimbabwe. In their groundbreaking study, Zimbabwe Takes Back Its Land, which incidentally is where I was finally able to have some of the self-funded trip photographs I made to document this land reform process in 2001 published, being one of the last foreign media allowed to access the activities of the Zimbabwean war veterans and their role in the land reform process, which they in fact initiated and drove. The mainstream media, and indeed our South African alternative media, would not touch it. So successful was the project of discrediting any narrative other than that of demonizing the process of land reform. To execute such a project successfully, I would need a minimum of 3 months in the field. The resources to do so have eluded me thus far, and it's no mystery why. It's worth elaborating on the process of producing images, especially for an extended essay, project, or book. This, of course, requires extended periods of time in the field, and where the subject matter is located matters. Where the subject matter is throughout southern Africa, then the resources required greatly increase. Not to say that the subject matter can't also be found locally as well, and often documentary photographers are forced by circumstances to work mostly locally, within walking distance often, and this suits street photography most. but is not possible when a project is driven by an idea and the subject has to be found elsewhere, which is sometimes, actually often the case. Suffice to say that even in a project such as my trilogy, some subjects are also close at hand, such as the Zanzibari community originating in King's Rest in the Bluff and relocated to Wentworth and Bayview in Chatsworth, descendants of slavery, or the many Khoi and Chikwe descendants who live in KwaZulu-Natal, such as in the suburb of Sunnydale in Eshowe, which was created by the British to house their many wagon drivers and such workers, who were mostly Khoi. During and after the conquest of the Zulu people, and of course most famously the Chikwa of Kokstad and East Griqualand, which the British destroyed, somewhat further off, of course, Khoi and Chikwa people reside in Durban itself and are becoming quite active here. Just to give you an idea of the costs at stake when embarking on a project which requires extensive travel, although you are all well aware, of course, of the cost of travel, my next envisioned field trip for the trilogy project is calculated at 7,000 kilometers, incorporating as it does the Lakes Bushmen of the Ermelo Lakes region in Mpumalanga, the base folk descendants of Transfrontier Kundrad base in the northern province, the Khoi fish kraals off the coast of Arniston and Stilbaai, revisiting the Khoi of the Cat River and the Khoi community of Frimersheim near Mossel Bay, the Trans-Kgalagadi Bushmen and Tsodila Hills in Botswana, which is a Bushman spiritual site still in continual use that dates back to the era of snake worship, amongst other people and sites, to which I will have to subject my 29 years old truck, not to mention my 66 years old body. Fuel costs alone for this journey amount to 20,000 Rand. Then there is accommodation for what could amount to 2 months of travel. Working in mostly rural areas is not able to be organized beforehand. One discovers the people and subjects that one finds of interest mostly when in the desired location and has to accommodate their time and movements. I stay mostly in campsites when traveling, finding this the most affordable way of doing so. Conservatively, at 250 rands per night, this amounts to 15,000 rands for the 2 months, and to this add another 15,000 rands for subsistence meals, water, etc. So without any costs considered for emergencies, you are looking at around 50,000 rand minimum for this 2-month field trip. 2 months for this kind of work is inadequate to begin with and does not allow for working when light or when weather conditions are best, or at an optimum. One is forced to do what is possible within the time constraints you are faced with. I've already done two such research field trips for the trilogy. One fortunately funded by a UCT fellowship, University of Cape Town, the other by myself. Most of the work produced in the making of Unsettled was possible through a very generous Mellon Foundation grant, made possible by a Rhodes Senior Fellowship. I have to thank very supportive and forgiving family members for largely making this possible, at great expense to themselves, and am cognizant of how almost impossible it is to produce work in our neoliberal economy, where if it doesn't pay, it doesn't play, without being in a position to fund the projects oneself. The alternative to government funding is, of course, philanthropies, of which there are quite a few, but in my experience, philanthropies themselves also have agendas, with which I have yet to find a fit. If I were to articulate in a sentence the thought that has driven me to photography and sustained me throughout, it would be that this is your reality, yet look at you. You are far more than the oppression and dispossession you are being subjected to now. And because of this unshifting position, I remain an activist photographer, indeed, a cultural worker. Today, it is not so much as class consciousness as in the working class. I mean, can one talk of the working class in the Marxian sense when unemployment is the order of the day? So, we are not even talking about the proletariat, again in the Marxian sense, since the definition of the proletariat is those without capital and dependent on daily labor for subsistence, when the opportunity for paid daily labor hardly exists. What we are talking about is the global majority, or the global south, to use a contemporary term, who are subject to such arduous living conditions, unable to achieve their true potential and live lives of dignity, and who are reorganizing themselves and rising, not to be confused with the political party that's got the similar name. The people have been led astray by a diminishing of poorly paid jobs and a tawdry ephemera of a vision that flickers through screens of mirrored American, African, Wakanda dreams, all the while living the nightmare of the greatest inequality on earth. Currently, as part of the African Documentary Photographers Archive Initiative, Art for Humanity Partnership, I have been engaged for the last 3 years in digitizing my analog negative archive, an extraordinary experience. And one of the most notable things has been to see just how much healthier people were back in the 80s. I think social scientists and economists can agree that the quality of life for the poor, the vast majority, is much harsher now. Even in the US, that bastion and originator of neoliberal capitalism, incomes for the working people have remained constant from the mid-70s onwards, while the cost of living has surged. Much more so here, mired as we were and are in the great inequalities saddled on us by the apartheid project. We entered our democratic moment having to divest ourselves of our intention for a socialist future and embrace wholeheartedly the coming of age of the neoliberal economy, with its 3 pillars of privatization, deregulation, and fiscal austerity for the people, like an amputation without anesthetic, something Palestinians are experiencing literally. Even Europeans, as are the middle class in North America, are being subjected to the ravages of neoliberalism and being introduced to austerity. The middle class ravaged, and indeed Europe deindustrialized. Such is the age we have entered. In considering our age and the times we are living through, I have come to understand and comprehend the centrality of geopolitics and economics in the dramas being played out, called The Great Game by Empire. Geopolitics, as defined by its creator Halford Mackinder's Heartland Theory, which is who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. This theory, continued by his neoconservative acolytes such as former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, and contemporaries such as the U.S. Undersecretary of State of Political Affairs Victoria Nuland, who is the architect of the Ukrainian crisis and who has just announced her impending retirement from the job, perhaps to pursue more nefarious underhand strategies, I imagine. And the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who is playing out now in Ukraine and the Baltic states, which is the heartland. And indeed, the deindustrialization of Europe, which is the world island, and the great power politics as Western empire attempts to thwart the rise of the multipolar world and its challenge to their control and command of the world, and resist their own demise. Along with geopolitics is, of course, economics, expressed and contested mostly in that of the real versus the financialized economy of speculation, derivatives. A derivatives bubble of 1.8 quadrillion exists, mind-boggling, beyond. And hypothecation, also known as the casino economy, into which a politically liberated South Africa entered post-1994. And with the advent of the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy, or GEAR, which of course is the expression of the neoliberal economy, that was proto-tested in the post-Allende coup of Chile's Pinochet and spread like wildfire around the world since. And of course, neoliberal economy is a product of the Chicago School, and which is itself a product of the Austrian school of economy. This failed model, which did irreparable damage in our frail South African post-apartheid economy, is now shape-shifting into the Green New Deal, carbon economy of the World Economic Forum, in which the failures, and there are failures, intend to reinvent themselves and their wealth, largely once again at the expense of the global majority, and increasingly their own middle class. Thomas Malthus and Limits to Growth define this paradigm, expressed currently as the green economy and the Great Reset, Malthusianism, as living on a finite planet and a dying universe. In such an austere environment, that of a closed system defined by entropy, where there is not enough to go round, and amassing and hoarding wealth is justified by such a us and them scenario, versus a concept of life in an expanding universe or open system, in which there are no limits to growth, one which is defined by abundance, the only limits being our imaginations. The real economy is a reflection of this paradigm, one in which we create abundance by using our thoughts in a very real way to change our universe and reality, as for instance in accessing energy from a once barely usable substance such as coal, and later nuclear from uranium, and yet to be developed fusion energy. Increased energy, of course, allows us to increase the products from found resources, including mineral and synthetic chemicals at our disposal. A counter-prevailing order to that of closed systems thinking is that of open systems theory, expressed and articulated best by Ukrainian, Russian biogeochemist Vladimir Vernadsky, where the biosphere, the thin envelope over the face of the globe, which shapes and is shaped by living matter, is not a closed system and defined by entropy, as is assumed by Darwinians, but rather an open system shaped by the intersection of cosmic radiation and internal radiation emanating from within the earth, and is perceived as being in a state of anti-entropy, in which life evolves in non-linear leaps from lower to higher states of life, and from unconscious life to conscious life, and from conscious life to self-conscious thinking life. A higher process of creation of new systems is at place here, always moving towards expressing ever greater degrees of freedom of action and complexity towards the expression of human life. In open system theory, resources are understood as infinite, subject only to creative access, and challenges are pure potential. In an open system, the biosphere is not only cosmic in nature, but a singular process directed by flow of creative disequilibrium towards ever higher states of anti-entropy and creation, not death, homogenization, or decay. Vernadsky writes, and I quote, "The creation resulting from new forms of living forms adapts itself to new forms of existence, augments the ubiquity of life, enlarges its domain. Life penetrates thus the regions of the biosphere where it had not earlier had access." End of quote. When humanity appeared on the scene, a new geological phenomenon began expressing itself in a form which Vernadsky described as the noosphere, in which atoms are organized by human thought, as opposed to the lithosphere, in which atoms are organized in non-biotic nature, and the biosphere, in which atoms are organized in biotic nature. A new geological force to be driven by human creative reason, a new phenomenon on our planet, in which for the first time man becomes a large-scale geological force capable of rebuilding the province of his life by his work and thought, rebuilding it radically in comparison with the past as wider and wider creative possibilities open before him, guided by an asymmetrical harmony and progress from lower to higher states of organization. In Vernadsky's mind, neither the noosphere nor the biosphere obeyed a law of mathematical equilibrium or stasis. And this is interesting in a time when we hear that we humans are the problem. Back to documentary photography, which, like art and everything else, is embedded in this closed system Western economy and subject to its death throes. Our role as cultural workers, however we define ourselves, is to critique this moment, both the economy and its effects, including its demise and the rise of the New World. The art world is, of course, largely owned and controlled by this Western-dominated economy. But it is the very nature of art to resist and rise beyond the confines of containment. Photography is, of course, a technical medium, requiring the use of what is essentially a scientific instrument, the camera and lens. Before the advent of computer-based cameras, one needed a thorough understanding of this medium and science, how light works, chemicals, etc., to be proficient in its use. I, of course, had none of the above, and almost always only had the most rudimentary equipment, often second-hand gear close to collapse. The negatives from my earlier years before I acquired some home-based basic knowledge was shaky at best, and the images often ill-exposed, grainy, and seldom in focus. The same with darkroom proficiency, which I gave up on a long time ago, relying on those with recognized skills to produce fine prints far better than I ever could make. And thank you, Dennis De Silva of Silvertone, for playing that role. I have retained the use of analog photography, still using a film-based camera and 50mm fixed lens, and preferring prints on silver-based paper produced in a darkroom and chemical environment, with its fidelity to the physical rather than the divergence from the physical world that is digital. Our entry into a digital world as a species, one defined by a divergence from the physical to that of the intangibility of the virtual, that is digital, which is a map, not a territory, is it to enter a new and foreign environment, which, whilst it is itself inevitable, is compounded by the fact that it is done without the control and consent of us, the people. Driven as it is by shadowy big money elite interests, and described by sociologist Shoshana Zuboff in her groundbreaking work, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, the fight for a human future at the new frontier of power. As a global system of behavioral modification and control, and ominous behavioral futures markets, where predictions about our controlled behavior are bought and sold, which threatens human nature in the 21st century, just as industrial capitalism disfigured the natural world, which includes us humans, and I'd add colonialism and slavery did in the 19th and 20th century. We the people need to be hip to the scene and fight for our right to control these technologies, which are our birthright in every configuration, be it machine learning, artificial intelligence, with transhumanism itself perhaps being a bridge too far. Technology is here to stay, and like every tool used by man since the inception of humanity, can either liberate or enslave, depending on whose hands it is in, i.e., who owns and controls it. In the West, technology is owned almost exclusively by corporations, who collude with governments to develop these technologies largely through the military-industrial complex, with the people's beneficiation very low on the agenda. China, on the other hand, with the Communist People's Party at the helm, does far more to ensure that technology also beneficiates its people, and that corporations do not indulge in excesses. Just ask Alibaba's Jack Ma how that works. It is philosophies of being, of what it means to be human, which will decide the future of humanity in these new technological frontiers. And it is not inevitable that we humans need to be dominated or indeed made obsolete by technologies of our own making, which have the possibilities of in fact liberating us. And it is in light of the above that I seek to understand both dominant philosophies that control and define our existence, such as that of Aristotle's, elevated by the elites above that of Plato and Socrates, of being governed by noble thought and intent, which have given us the reduced democracy of today, which continues to serve elite interests and their corporate fascism. Contrast that to, say, that of Confucius, which is at the core of Chinese thought today, and see how it benefits the Chinese people through its core values. I am at heart an optimist, and I would be remiss if I ended on a pessimistic note, for I am gripped by a far greater hope and vision. This vision is based on the reality, as befits a documentary photographer, grounded in reality, and is that of our current alliance with the Belt and Road Project through BRICS, and the revival of the Great Silk Road, the real economy, of which Africa was long a part. Peace through development is at the heart of this win-win economic plan, and this project has demonstrated its ability to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and Africa is seen as the land of great potential that it is, and liberating its greatest potential, its people, is at hand. If Africa was underdeveloped by the Western neocolonial project, as is asserted by social scientists such as Walter Rodney and others, then it can face a radically different future in a multipolar world, driven by a philosophy and worldview of the win-win of multipolarity rather than the zero sum of the colonial West, in which prosperity for all and abundance is a core principle. Our children deserve nothing less. Thank you.